In 2011, a story broke in the news about a dog named Honeybun, who you could say had a taste for some of the finer things in life. And Honeybun would spend each day with his owner at the jewelry store. And one day a customer came in, and the store owner, the dog owner, Chuck Roberts, jumped up to tend to that customer's needs, leaving on the counter an open bag of diamonds. Well, after the customer left, Roberts went back to begin examining those diamonds again, and all he found was an empty bag. And so we frantically began searching. He searched all around the counter. He searched all around the floor, everywhere he could think. And then he finally looked down at his dog, Honeybun, the only other living thing in that store besides him. He grabbed the dog and he ran to get that dog x-rayed, and the pictures revealed that it had 2 white blotches in its stomach, likely missing treasure. So Roberts waited, and he waited, and he waited even longer. In fact, that he had never been so interested in the digestive health of a dog. The next day, sure enough, Honeybun gave back all 10,000 worth of those diamonds the only way that the dog could. And Roberts, by the way, never shared if those diamonds were sold later at a discounted rate because of what they had been through. But you know, I read that story and I thought, man, that dog did not know the value of things, did it? It just didn't have this understanding of what the value of those diamonds were. You know, I think there are times in our lives where we don't always understand the true value of things. There are times where we don't fully appreciate the meaning behind something, the significance that it brings, the important role that it might play in our lives. And that's the essence of what we have been talking about the last few weeks in our series, The Treasure Principle. There is something more valuable than just storing up treasures on earth, which is storing up treasures in heaven. Our purpose in this series is to help each of us unlock the secret of joyful giving, because that's what giving is supposed to be. It's supposed to be joyful. That's what it's meant to be. Our money and our possessions shouldn't be about trying to just maximize our comfort on earth, but using them to make an eternal difference by giving to kingdom causes. And to do this, we've been looking at different treasure principles keys. They just help us unlock that treasure box. And so far, we've looked at 2 of these. And treasure principle key number 1 was God is the owner. We are the managers. God's the owner. We are simply the managers. Now, treasure principle key number 2 was this: my heart always goes where I put God's money. My heart always goes where I put God's money. Sometimes we think our money follows our heart. But as we looked at last week, our heart often follows our money. Now today we are going to roll through very quickly treasure principle number 3, number 4, and number 5. Okay, it took us about 3 weeks to get through 2 treasure principles. Today we're doing 3 in one sitting, so we have a lot of ground to cover. So if you have your bulletin, I encourage you to get your outline out, follow along as we walk through this together. In April 2019, so almost a couple of years ago, Brittany and I celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary by going to New York City. And we had a tremendous time on that trip. In fact, as we even reflected back on it recently, we are so glad that we went in April of 2019 rather than April of 2020, because it is kind of an expensive trip, and we thought about waiting another year before we would go, and of course we all know the whole place would have been shut down by then. So we're so thankful we went when we did. And we did all the major tourist things. You know, when you go to a big city, you go to a big place, attraction place, you want to do all the tourist touristy things and you look like a tourist. Well, we saw the Statue of Liberty, which was just amazing. We saw the Lion King on Broadway. We went to the top of the Empire State Building. We visited the 9/11 Museum. That took a full day in and of itself. We visited Trump Tower, which was just beautiful. And we even had time to visit a few lesser known places like France's Tavern, which was built in 1719. Not many people know about this. I'm going to give you a little side history piece here, but it's the oldest standing structure in all of Manhattan. 1719. It's a small museum upstairs, and it's a colonial-style restaurant downstairs. And by the way, if you did not know this about Manhattan, that much of Manhattan is actually man-made land. And much of those buildings are actually built on top of trash landfill of the the colonists. And some of those beautiful buildings with the apartments and the office buildings and just all those structures, they were actually built on top of trash, including France's Tavern. And that's just a side history lesson for you. But while we were there, we ate great food. You know, when you go traveling, you always got to eat good food, don't you? We pizza to Katz's Deli, Jewish deli in 1888, and just amazing trip. But when you go to a place like New York, or you go to some other notable place, you want to take a lot back with you, don't you? You always want to bring a piece of it home as much as you can. And maybe for you're not a big city person. Maybe you like something different, but maybe you went to a national park. Maybe you went to a fun attraction place like Pigeon Forge or Gatlinburg, Tennessee. But regardless of where you may have loved to have visited, there is just a natural desire within us to want to take some of that back. Right? To take it home with us. We always want to take something back. Could you imagine being at the airport just trying to figure out how to stuff your suitcases full of all these things that you bought? But of course, it's not realistic, right? You're going just to visit. And when you visit a place, it's not your home. You don't acquire possessions in a temporary residence. You don't fill your hotel room with wall hangings and goods from the local shops and manufacturers. You don't do that. It'd be silly to do that. You enjoy the things around you. You enjoy them, but you don't store them up because you're just a visitor. And that's treasure principle number 3. Treasure principle number 3 is heaven, not earth, is my home. Heaven, not earth, is my home. Now, how quickly we forget this, and how hard it is at times for us to fully appreciate this. Paul reminds us of this when he wrote to the Christians in Philippi, Philippians 3:20. It says, "But our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ." You know, you can vote here. You can pay taxes here. You can buy a home here. But your citizenship, our citizenship really is more of the status of a temporary resident. When we fully grasp this as Christians, it should change how we live and how we approach things, how we see things, which brings us then to treasure principle number 4, which is I should live not for the dot, but for the line. I should live not for the dot, but for the line. Since we are temporary residents here, and our citizenship, our long-term life is in heaven, we should live for the dot. We should not live for the dot. We should live for the line. Now, I want you to imagine for just a moment that this rope is kind of a visual of eternity, okay? Now let's pretend this rope goes and goes. It doesn't end, okay? It just keeps going. Millions and millions and millions and millions of years. It just kind of keeps on going, okay? This is eternity. Now, if this rope is eternity, this little blue part right here represents your life on earth. Okay, so what happens is you're born here, okay, and you learn to walk right here, and you learn to drive right here. You graduate from high school, you go to college, or you start a career, and then you work. You retire here, and then you die here at the end of the blue, right? And in fact, if you, as Americans, the average age, life expectancy in America is 79 years old. All right, we rank number 46 in the world as a nation. Now, if you live in Nigeria, you are ranked at the bottom. You only have a life expectancy of about 55 years. Now, if you live in Hong Kong, your life expectancy is number 1 in the world at 85 years old, and if you are a woman, it is 88 years old. They have the longest life expectancy of people in the world. And what's crazy is that if this is a visual of all of eternity, right? If this is a visual of all of eternity, it just keeps going. It never ends. And this is our life on earth. In comparison, so many of us live, do, and just say crazy things about this little time. We are so consumed about this little time and the big picture of eternity. And we think, oh, well, you know what? If I don't get into that grad school that I want to get into, it's going to ruin the rest of my life, you know. Or we think, well, I'm going to work so hard in this amount of time so I can retire and really just I really want to enjoy this amount of time, and so we just, I want to travel and I want to do this, and so we just consume ourselves with really trying to live the most incredible life we can in this blue timeline. And even as Christians, I think we probably spend a little too much time thinking about the blue and not enough time thinking about the rest of eternity. But it's hard not to be consumed with the blue, isn't it? It's so hard. Mike gave some great statistics. Actually, I didn't even plan that, but I have some statistics similar to that on my own. The world just competes for our time and our attention and our money, doesn't it? Do you know that in the pre-pandemic America, that Americans shopped 6 to 8 hours a week while only spending 40 minutes playing with their children? Did you know that 30 years ago, in 1990, if you were 20 years old in 1990, so born in 1970, turned 20 years old in 1990, you were exposed to 1 million commercials by the time you were 20. Now, Forbes magazine just last year came out with statistics similar for 2020. If you were born in the year 2000 and you turned 20 in the year 2020, you were exposed not just to 1 million advertisements, but 35 million advertisements. In 30 years, we went from being exposed to 1 million to 35 million. Everything telling you what you need, how you need to live, what you need to have to fit in, how to have your best life, right? Andrew Carnegie once said, "Millionaires seldom smile." John D. Rockefeller said, "I have made many millions, but they have brought me no happiness." In fact, at one point, at his peak, Rockefeller controlled 1% of the entire U.S. economy. It is incredible the wealth that he had when he had it. Now, the Bible tells us that what we do during this little time, this little stretch, this little blue area, what we do in this little area determines how we spend all the rest of this. What we do here determines all of this. And what we do here makes a difference. And the Bible says, make the most of it. Make the most of it, but not for us, right? Not for our benefit, but for God, right? Not for our benefit, but in order for us to help others. Make the most of this part, not so we can just simply enjoy this part, but because it makes a difference regarding the rest of eternity. So live not for the dot, but live for the line. Okay? It's treasure principle number 4. Hebrews 11:16 says this, instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now that verse is talking about Abraham. It's in the chapter of Hebrews, all about faith. And that word, that it says longing. It uses the word longing there. They were longing for a better country, which means to be eager for, to aspire to kind of stretch forth. There was this anticipation they had about this next place. They craved a better country, but not one on earth. It says a heavenly one, a heavenly one. They were looking forward to not what was ahead in their life on earth in that little blue spot, but and thinking, oh, maybe we'll get a raise and maybe we'll get a tax break. Maybe we'll try that new restaurant that opened up in town. They weren't so much concerned about that part. They were concerned about the heavenly part. And Abraham and Sarah were looking forward to their heavenly home. They were living for the line, not the dot. Which brings us to treasure principle number 5. Treasure principle number 5 is giving is the only antidote to materialism. Giving is the only antidote to materialism. The best way to overcome materialism is to give it away. We looked at the story of the rich young ruler last week, and that's exactly what Jesus told him to do, isn't it? Give it away, give it to the poor, give it to those who need it. You know, when I was a kid, I had a blankie. I don't know if you ever had a blankie or whatever you might call it when you were a young child, or maybe you had a favorite stuffed animal. And, you know, kids, when we're kids, we kind of take these around with us, don't we? Man, and you take the blanket, you take the stuffed animal, and they get nasty. Like, they get so gross. Kids in their grimy hands and food, and they suck on their blankets, they sleep. I had a blankie, and I took this thing everywhere. I took it to church, and I played outside with it. I watched Sesame Street with it. I slept with it. I did everything with it, and it was full of holes. It was full of stains. It was just becoming this raggedy old blanket, right? And I held on to it for far too long, okay? I had trouble giving this up. While most of the other kids my age had released theirs and they had moved on, I still held mine. And one day I remember my mom told me we were going to throw this away, and I remember watching as the trash man, I still remember where I stood in the driveway, and I watched the trash man come. It was trash day, and he flipped our cans and emptied them into the back of the truck, and I watched as it included my blanket, and I watched as they drove away. I still remember, and it was this hard moment for me. I'm still going through counseling with it, and and all that. But it was necessary, wasn't it? It was so necessary because I had to move past the blankie stage. You don't want to start kindergarten carrying a blankie. You don't want to go into first grade carrying a blankie. You can't really do that, right? Some of us need to move past the materialism stage, right? We've been holding it for far too long. Maybe through the influence of culture or just whatever it might be, we've gotten sidetracked and we've lost focus on the eternal. And we've kept more of a focus on just the earthly. But we need to reverse that. We've been holding on to something for far too long, and it's holding us back. Giving is the antidote to materialism. In 1 Timothy 6:17-19, Paul wrote, he said, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasures for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." I really like how he ends that phrase. Take hold of the life that's truly life. Truly life. Years ago, John Ortberg shared about how his grandmother taught him how to play Monopoly. And he wrote these words. He wrote, "Now my grandmother was a wonderful person. She raised 6 children. She was a widow by the time I knew her well. She lived in our house for many, many years, and she was a lovely woman, but she was the most ruthless Monopoly player I have ever known in my life." Imagine what would have happened if Donald Trump had married Leona Helmsley and they would have had a child. Then you have some picture of what my grandmother was like when she played Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game was to acquire. When we would play when I was a little kid, and I got my money from the bank, I would always want to save it and hang on to it because it was just so much fun to have money. She spent on everything she landed on, and then when she bought it, she would mortgage it as much as she could and buy everything else that she landed on. She would accumulate everything she could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And every time I landed, I would have to pay her money. And eventually, every time she would take my last dollar, I would quit in utter defeat. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and she would say, "One day, you'll learn to play the game." I hated it when she said that to me. But one summer, I played Monopoly with a neighbor kid, a friend of mine, almost every day, all day long. We'd play Monopoly for hours. And that summer, I learned to play the game. I came to understand the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. And I sat down with her to play it that fall. Slowly, cunningly, I exposed my grandmother's vulnerability. Restlessly, inexorably, I drove her off the board. The game does strange things to you. I can still remember it happened at Marvin Gardens. I looked at my grandmother. She taught me how to play the game. She was an old lady by now. She was a widow. She had raised my mom. She loved my mom. She loved me. And I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. It was the greatest moment of my life. And then she had one more thing to teach me. Then she said, now it all goes back in the box. All those houses and hotels, all the railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money, now it all goes back in the box. I didn't want it to go back in the box. I wanted to leave the board out, bronze it maybe, a memorial to my ability to play the game. No, she said, none of it was really yours. You got all heated up about it for a while, but it was around a long time before you sat down at the board, and it will be here after you're gone. Players come and players go, but it all goes back in the box. And he finished with this. He said, and the game always ends. For every player, the game ends. Every day you pick up a newspaper and you can turn to a page that describes people for whom this week the game ended. Skilled businessmen, an aging grandmother who was in a convalescent home with a brain tumor, teenage kids who think they have the whole world in front of them, and somebody drives through a stop sign. It all goes back in the box. Houses and cars, titles and clothes, filled barns, bulging portfolios, even your body. Heaven, not earth, is our home. I should not live for the dot, but for the line. Giving is the only antidote to materialism. And if you have your outline, flip it over to the back side. There's a Monopoly dollar there and a big blank in the middle. And the words that go there are, in the end, it all goes back in the box. In the end, it all goes back in the box. Would you pray with me?